aggression exacerbating organization. And why I say that is, I think really what I'm going to try and kind of highlight is that we all, I'd say, play a part in this, right? Meaning that sometimes folks that we work with might be more prone to aggression, fair enough, but also sometimes our organizational systems might exacerbate people and lead people to feel more aggressive. And also sometimes providers are in scenarios where they're prone to engage with folks in a way that might exacerbate aggression. And oftentimes that's organizationally related, I would argue. And just really quick about this, I worked for 10 years in New York City started off as a peer support, not certified, a peer support specialist for people who are homeless with substance use disorders, and eventually went on to do sort of management type stuff. And I got very interested / concerned about the way in which our systems in New York were exacerbating what I believed people's sort of aggressive tendencies, and did a lot of work in that area to try and make things more harmonious for everybody. And then I worked at Frontline, which is a community mental health center in Cleveland that works predominantly with people with serious mental illness and who are homeless, and basically ran into the same issues. And when I was director there, I was the lead in implementing trauma-informed care at that organization, specific to the levels of aggression and violence we were experiencing in our lobby, that our CPSTs were experiencing, doing home visits, things like that. So I'm kind of going to speak from those experiences. So essentially, I'm going to try and help us all understand how trauma-informed care may reduce clients' aggressive behaviors, really talk about trauma-informed care specifically related to clients' aggression, like the core elements of trauma-informed care, and then perhaps come up with some organizational provider-level strategies to enhance client and staff safety. I'm hoping as part of the conversation, you all can share your own lessons learned. I thought it was so cool that I was read on the individual level where, I can't remember who her name is because I'm barely ever on here, but she was aware that some of her clients had some aggressive tendencies that they had a hard time managing, and helped funnel that into boxing. I mean, that is like awesome. That's a really nice individual level type intervention. On that note, just really quick, I was the manager of a Housing First program for people with serious mental illness and who are homeless in Cleveland. And a lot of our clients, we had a lot of aggressive, violent behavior that occurred there up front. And we kind of did surveys and focus groups with them, and they thought it would be helpful to have a gym to work out in. And it's funny, the more cynical staff were saying, well, now they're just going to be stronger and they're going to be better at beating people up. And we were like, no, I don't think that'll be the case. They probably know what's best. And we then created an atmosphere or a setting where they could work out, bench press, all that. We developed a workout club. And that, along with a lot of other things, really decreased the aggression because people had something to do with their physical energy. So I like to start off with the human side of things. So basically, this was at a homeless shelter, and we were very concerned about the aggression there. So part of what I did was I went around and I interviewed the people who were living in this homeless shelter, and this is specifically for folks with psychiatric issues. And I asked them basically kind of what triggers you and what helps calm you down. And this is what one person said that I think really mapped on to what a lot of other people said. When staff treats you like a human being, and this is her own words, we already feel beat down, embarrassed, I feel like a failure every second of every day. When you get listened to and respected by staff, that gives me my humanity. And this is a real theme about listening, which is why we began to do this on a macro and a micro level. And then, so I also asked the people there, I said, what staff member is the very best at de-escalating stuff? Basically, when stuff jumps off, who is really good at calming folks down? It is amazing, like you can barely get anybody to all vote for one thing, right? But they all voted for this one person. So I had to ask her, what is it that you do? And she said, I just try to get to know them, listen to them. Listening is different than hearing. She really emphasized that. What they like, what calms them down. So that way, if they go off, I can use that. It makes it easier to get the situation under control. Basically, what she was saying, right, is she creates a crisis plan for each individual coming in, but through this conversation and this listening process. And I'll say, and this is a very trauma-informed care thing, This is a person who didn't have very much power in our organization. She actually probably had about the least amount of power in our organization. Guess what we did? We gave her power to train us on how to interact with people. And this is a very that was unique to our organization, but why wouldn't we learn from her, right? She seems to know what's going on better than we do. So trauma-informed care, appreciating, predicting, responding to issues of victimization, basically. And you try and create services that avoid doing harm, re-traumatizing folks, and giving them tools to manage their traumatic reactions. And a lot of this is really about empowering and being less directive and listening to folks. And I'll give some examples of that. And it's this cultural and philosophical shift within an agency. So this is not a provider level. Certainly there's things you can do on a provider level, but this is really an organizational issue. To understanding traumatic stress and developing strategies for responding to the complex needs of survivors and providers. So again, I like to talk through things for a moment. So what does this really mean, right? So when I was working in Cleveland, we had a lobby where there was a really significant level of violence and aggression that was occurring over a period of time that was leading us to be very concerned. And, we had this epiphany that, hey, maybe we should talk to the people who actually sit in the lobby and find out what it's like to sit in the lobby. What do they like about it? What don't they like about it? What would they recommend? And they came up with some really practical things that we then implemented. This could be different by organization, but I think the point is to ask, right? We created focus groups, we gave people bus tickets to attend, and then we wondered with them what would help. And they said some really specific things. First of all, our population predominantly identified as Black or African American. They said, why do all the magazines got white people on them? Makes me pissed off to look at that. I'm sorry, I gotta be real, because just to say it like they did. And therefore, then we got more diverse magazines, right? Then a second thing, we have nothing to do here. We're just sitting and waiting. So then we created this whiteboard that went around the entire lobby where they could draw, they could write, they could do art. We got mandalas. Many of them said they like to do mandalas. So we had mandalas everywhere. And then a really practical thing was our clients had busy lives. They would have to take buses. They would say, it makes me really pissed off when I come in 15 minutes late and I get told I got to come back again. I'd saved this bus ticket for 2 weeks. And so what we did was we also figured there was a place where people could eat at lunch very close by there for free. So we had basically a clinic that would be open from 1 to 2 after people would eat. So if somebody coming at 8 and then they were late, it would be distressing. We would say, could you hang out, go get a free lunch at noon, come back at 1 o'clock, and it's likely we could see you then. So we had one person with prescription privileges who would be available for that hour to see the people who were late, right? We also did contingency management for the people that were on time. We gave them a bus ticket. And what we found was the level of aggression and frustration around late appointments went away, literally went away. And guess what? The lobby had more productivity because then you had these folks who were getting seen during that hour. It wasn't just missed appointments. And you all know, if someone's waiting around for a while, maybe the 10 to 10:15 appointment doesn't show. So then that person can scoot in there. So that's just an example of how you listen to the population you're serving to try and get ideas from them. So in terms of trauma-informed care research, it was an intervention really created in inpatient psychiatric units to decrease aggression and violence and to help everyone feel more safe. I have to say there's not been any randomized clinical trials yet. There's been a lot of these pre-post. So, there are limitations certainly on what the research suggests. But these are, and I always like to pull at least one more current research. But basically, these two studies fit the basic theme of what we found is that, or those folks have found, is that essentially, at least in pre and post surveys, that the implementing trauma-informed care leads to a decrease in aggressive behaviors. And in particular in inpatient settings, that leads to less seclusion and restraint. I know in outpatient settings, we don't do that anyways. for the most part, unless you're working with younger people. But essentially, this pretty much maps on to what the data suggests as a whole, is that it seems to be associated with, I should say, decreased aggression. And the other thing is that typically staff report feeling more confident about their work and feeling safer in their work after trauma-informed care has been implemented. So some kind of like basic premises is that de-escalating patients it's an integrated experience. And I used to kind of joke, one of my favorite jobs was de-escalating the lobby because I'm high on sensation seeking. It's a little bit about me. But I would kind of joke that if I'd had an argument with my wife or I had a bad day, I said, oh my God, it's going to be a bad day in the lobby today, because I was already not well, right? Like I came in with a little bit of an attitude. And really, I would see how that could exacerbate something when I'm being short or somewhat dismissive. So we're arguing that it's an integrative experience. The clients, patients come in with their own stuff. We come in with our own stuff. All that joins together to create either a calming, empowering, soothing interaction or a more adversarial, short, dismissive interaction. And we all have precipitating factors, things that happen before we ever saw one another that lead to that issue. And this is really hard, and we had to work with this a lot. I have to work on this myself and with our staff, is that notion of rational detachment. Basically, to be aware that the person acting out, and they may even be really good at pulling on your vulnerabilities, just stay as even keel as you can and be aware that this isn't personal about me. And my role is to help this person to calm down, and I need to model that. Therefore, I need to maintain a calm demeanor as best I can. So how do you support staff? So, the other thing I've kind of realized is that for staff to come in and feel well and to be empowering and compassionate and listen to folks, they need to be taken care of too, or I would argue. And a lot of times I get this kind of thing where people say, well, I don't have time because of productivity, which I get because I was in that same kind of environment. And what I did was I asked anybody who would listen for grant money to provide my staff to get reimbursed for their direct service, whatever they lose for direct service, to be able to sit together and do some emotional work, some resiliency work. And it took me about 2 years, but ultimately I found an organization that funded that. So what they did is they funded 90 minutes every 2 weeks where the staff could meet. And they did two things. They went through the compassion fatigue workbook. No leaders were involved. It was run by them because sometimes we were at odds with their compassion fatigue or exacerbating their compassion fatigue, as well as trauma stewardship. So they kind of went back and forth with those two workbooks and did work. I know that can be hard and you may not be able to do that, but I just want to say we did eventually find people who would fund that because they understood how it related to staff turnover, how staff turnover affected organizations and clients. And we were able to show that through implementing these resiliency activities, our staff did stabilize. We also, at that same center, we did a study that I thought was kind of interesting where we had staff where we did basically a randomized controlled trial where we had staff in 3 groups. One group, they did 15 minutes of just basically not working. They could do whatever they wanted to do. They made, like, if they're like me, they're looking on ESPN website or something like that. But they could do whatever they wanted to do. The second group did 15 minutes where they were learning meditation, and then they practiced a meditation exercise. And the third group, who were religious and also believed that religious practice was appropriate at work, they did religious practice. And what we found over those 3 groups is that at a 6-month period and lasting to 12 months is when we stopped looking. The group that did the religious activity had the most significant improvement. They reported better sleep. They also reported less state anxiety, state stress. The group that did meditation was just slightly below that. They still had a significant improvement and a larger improvement than the third group, which had no change. And that was the group that just had a 15-minute break. So what we began to do was kind of encourage staff to, first of all, take a 15-minute break. I know, again, productivity, it's hard. And I know I'm preaching to people who know how hard it is to even get that. But if you got 15 minutes, it may be a good use of your time to practice your religion or do meditation in terms of maintaining your well-being. We also created 2 rooms where staff could work on resiliency, where there was they could just relax in there with soft music and all that. Post-crisis activities are really important too. I worked with a lot of organizations where something jumps off and then no one really talks about it. There's no kind of debriefing. I think if things reach a real crisis level, it can be helpful to have EAP come in and manage these issues around that group. But also just kind of like a post-vention kind of exercises where you're just trying to look at what happened, how do we feel about that, what do we learn from that, what can we do to do things better, and then kind of strategize solutions. So, and it's also an exercise in really learning. Just a quick example of that, we used to be people's payee, which was an awful idea at Frontline. And we kind of realized at a certain point, this post-crisis activities, that 80% of our crises were related to being people's payee. And therefore, we very actively decided to make another organization the payee for folks. So with the therapeutic and the payee responsibilities were distinct. But again, it's one of those things that's like, duh, but we really needed to talk through all these exercises and kind of figure out what the problems were. So what does Sam say about the trauma-informed approach? First of all, appreciates that including, I know Nicole presented on this some weeks earlier, that trauma affects many people, including some of the patients that you see, some people who experience psychosis. And therefore, just go ahead and treat everybody as if they've experienced significant trauma. Because if they haven't, it's fine. All you're going to do is come across as compassionate and empowering. And if they have, well, good, then you're going to be less likely to re-traumatize. You recognize that many problem behaviors are understandable attempts to cope. I mean, even aggression, right? If I grew up in an environment where I felt safe and where I had to fight to make sure that I maintained my life, then why wouldn't I do that when I'm in a center where I feel cornered again? And I feel like I'm being kind of pushed against the wall, even if it's more verbally or through overly directive kind of interaction. Responds by trying to integrate knowledge about trauma into policies, procedures, and practices. And again, a large part of that is listening to people and giving them a seat at the table. And it tries to resist re-traumatization. So some of the principles and approach are making sure that people feel safe. That was a large part of kind of our lobby experience. Being trustworthy and transparent. So being as clear as we could with people about why we were doing what we were doing. If we said we were going to do something, try and definitely do that thing. Oh, the other thing they mentioned about the lobby too was they said that it would be really helpful to have peers that they looked up to who could help manage situations in the lobby. So we did that, and we found ways to incentivize. They weren't certified peer support specialists, but they were folks from the community that the Frontline folks were engaged in. Again, Frontline is very embedded in downtown Cleveland where there's lots of homeless shelters. We serve a homeless population. Some of those folks were very well known and respected. We picked them based on who they told us. Those folks were incentivized to hang out in the lobby and get positive messages to people, help calm people down when things kind of were, obviously they get clinical help when they needed, but just to create a presence that was more soothing. This notion of collaborating, so I think I've mentioned this a lot, trying to get clients at the table to figure out, how would they best like to work with us? What do they want us to know? Motivational interviewing is also considered an intervention that's very congruent with trauma-informed care because it's very collaborative. The empowerment, voice, and choice, that notion that we hear a lot, nothing about us without us, bringing folks at the table, understanding cultural, historical, and gender issues, understanding systems of oppression, even if you don't necessarily buy that groups of people have been oppressed, knowing that some of your patients may believe that and have those perceptions and acting accordingly based on their truth. I'm not going to go too much into this because I feel like you kind of probably know this, but some of the things to look out for, and someone was talking about you can create plans with people where they can help you understand what their trigger threat cues are. And on an organizational level, you can look at what are the things that seem to be that we're doing that are creating this kind of threat queue. So again, like our waiting room was boring. Boredom and waiting was an issue. So that was a thing that affected many people. So we addressed that. Things to avoid, clearly raising your voice. Sometimes I do it, but it's hard. I'd say the main thing is forgetting to focus on de-escalation. Like at that point when you're interacting with a person, you don't need to be right, you don't need to be smarter, you don't need to be whatever. At that point, your goal is to try and help the person get back to their baseline and to be at a less aggressive state. Other things is to make sure to stay focused on de-escalation, trying to keep that kind of, appropriate distance from somebody, trying to really kind of trying to sort of demonstrate this calm but present presence for the person. I'd say helping people really understand they have choices, right? So I did this about every day. I would say, okay, so we have a choice right now, or you have a choice right now. You can either choose to continue throwing chairs around the lobby, and I was very specific. I wasn't saying acting out or whatever. I was specific. You can either choose to continue throwing chairs around the lobby, which creates an environment where we feel unsafe. And if you continue to do that, then we'll have to call the police and likely you're going to go to the jail or to the hospital. And the second option you have is that you could stop throwing the chairs, sit back down, and we could meet your needs. Which one of those makes most sense to you right now? Literally, I did that every day. And being very clear on what the choices were, not saying, nah, you got to stop throwing that chair, because now you just push somebody in a corner. And you can be very clear on what the outcome's going to be in both directions. The other part is just developing crisis plans, and many of you did this, which is why I was kind of focusing on that earlier on, for each patient in an individualized way. It's okay to allow people to vent, right? Like if people need to walk around and curse and holler, we would say that's okay. People need that. That's more pro-social than hitting people or throwing chairs around. I'm trying to speak simply, not using jargon, which is why I would never say you need to act more appropriately or you need to whatever. I'd be very specific about what the behavior was. Helping people overcome insurmountable problems by helping them break it down in really small steps. And the last thing I did a ton of was reflective listening, because, I think it was a famous politician said about the Russians in a particular meeting, they're yelling because nobody's listening to them. So it's important to listen to folks. So this is kind of like, I would do this a lot. Someone would come in and say, y'all are making me wait to see my doctor, and they'd be very pissed off. And I would just reflect back to them. It didn't matter what the situation was. We're not being considerate of your time. We're wasting time. We're not helping you. And sometimes being kind of like that empathic statement about what the person's experiencing decrease the stress right there. So those are my resources. That was my spiel. So I'm really